Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Transgender School podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the upcoming presidential election in the United States.
So you're going to be listening to this episode in early August, but we're recording this on July 20th, and a lot might have changed in that time. There have been some really significant developments in both the 2024 campaign, but also just the news generally since we recorded our last episode. Former President Trump there's an attempted assassination on former President Trump at a rally he held in Pennsylvania. That was a really tragic incident where an attendee of the rally was killed in the audience, and that was a really significant event in world history and US history. Had he actually been assassinated, I think things would have gotten a lot worse than they already are here in the United States. I think that would have been a huge blow to the rule of law, to democracy here in the country, and we're frankly really lucky that bullet grazed his ear, or something grazed his ear, and that it did not do what the shooter intended it to do. The other significant event that's happened since we last recorded is that following, frankly, a really terrible performance in the first debate with former President Trump, President Biden has faced unprecedented pressure from other Democratic elected officials calling on him to drop out of the race. You might remember that when Biden first ran, he talked about being a bridge to the next generation of leadership in the Democratic Party. And there were a lot of questions about whether he would actually run for re-election in 2024. And he left that question open initially when he first ran. He had a very successful first couple years in office. He accomplished a lot, passing some really big bills in Congress, getting us out of Afghanistan. He could have resigned at that point, let Harris take over as president, and then we'd be in a very different position today. Unfortunately, this is a very last minute conversation that we're having as a party, but it is a very interesting, really unprecedented moment. And we've never had two people this old running for president. And so this is a very unique moment. And frankly, we don't know how it's going to play out. And things might have changed significantly by the time you listen, given the amount of people coming out pressuring him to drop out of the race. It's possible that he may no longer even be in the race, or maybe he's still in the race, and we're figuring out what that means at that point.
Yeah, I was really shocked when I watched the debate. Of course, I've been hearing about his cognitive decline and the concerns that people have in the Democratic Party, but it was still pretty painful to actually watch the debate and see him stumble so much and say, in some cases, the opposite of what he was actually trying to say, it felt like, and really have such a hard time. I felt compassion for him, but I really also did feel concern. I just want to state, I'm voting for the values and the policies I believe in. I agree with people that Biden is problematic at this point because of some of what we've seen, but I just can't even fathom that somebody then would choose to vote for Trump because their policies, what they advocate for, are so different. So I just think it's important to note that. And I'm just curious, Jackie, about your opinion, because there's so much talk about how he should step down and we should let Harris run, but then there's a lot of concern that that makes us look even more chaotic and last minute, that we're struggling at the last minute to try to change things that will make us more likely to win the election. Do you think that Biden should step aside?
I don't think that Biden's the best candidate. I'll vote for Biden if he is who is on the ballot. I agree with you that it's when we're going at the values of the Democratic Party versus the values of the Republican Party right now, it's a clear choice for me. But Biden doesn't need my vote. He is not polling as well as he was a few years ago. Trump kind of has a ceiling polling wise, but he's consistent. He has a ceiling, but he also has a base that's not going to go away. And I think it's really unfortunate. If Biden had run in 2016 and if he had become president in 2016, I think that we might be in a different world. He'd be winding down his second term. It wouldn't be a big deal that this is where he's at mentally. But I think when you're talking about re-electing someone for another 4 full years of the presidency, probably one of the hardest jobs in the world, just in terms of the physical demands of it. I mean, I've worked for local elected officials and on campaigns where you're working 60, 80-hour weeks and you're exhausted and you're miserable and you're in your 20s. And so the president to have to work the number of hours the president works, to have to be available 24/7, 365 days a year, like to experience that is a really draining thing on the human body. And you see what it does to people. You see what it does to their hair, their faces over time. There's the
Yep.
classic before and after images of every president. And so to have someone who is in their 80s doing that, I just think if they're all there mentally and they can demonstrate that, fine. But to give the performance that he gave at that debate and to wonder if that's who's showing up in the situation room when something happens at 3 a.m. and he needs to take charge, it's concerning. I think that there's a level of leadership, especially in the military sense, that there's a really heavy responsibility there for the president, and that's not something you can take lightly. And it's hard for the Democratic Party to put him forward as a candidate and say that we're a serious party and we take the threat of Trump seriously if this is who we're nominating. And so I think it'll be unfortunate if he becomes the nominee. I'll support him. I'll vote for him. I still think he's the better choice than Trump, but I
Right.
think it's an unfortunate missed opportunity if we move forward with this. I think that we should go a different direction right now, and I think that he's the one who has the power to make that happen by stepping back and saying, "I'm stepping back, and I'd like my vice president to take over." I understand that the vice president is not everyone's first choice, but I think that a candidate has to exist in the context of all that came before them. And I think that she is the vice president. I think that her polling is better than Biden's at this point, and she doesn't probably have a ceiling in the way that he does. She can actually go out and make the case for herself and be more coherent and have more energy than he does. And I think that that's an invaluable thing, and that has to be the minimum bar for a candidate at this point. And so I would be really glad to see her take over as the nominee, and frankly to see him step down and even allow her to run as an incumbent and to have some experience in that leadership role. I
Mm.
think
Hmm.
going back to that 3 a.m. question, I think she'd probably be a lot more ready to deal with an emergency at 3 a.m. than he would. And so I would sleep better knowing that she's the one dealing with that.
I agree with you, but I'm going to say, but you made such a strong case, Jackie, that I feel compelled to really strongly state, though, he'd be better than Trump. If it does come down to Biden and Trump, I want to implore you, please get out and vote for Biden. We're in agreement, Jackie, and I'm sure a lot of people listening or watching would agree that at this point it really seems like Harris would have a better shot at actually defeating Trump. But if it comes to Trump and Biden, there's absolutely no denying that Biden will be the better alternative, and especially if you care about LGBTQ rights. So that's what we want to really get into, since that's our focus on this podcast. And so Jackie has done a very thorough job of compiling a lot of news and research on what the two parties are saying, what Biden and Trump and all their people like JD Vance. We now know, we just found out that JD Vance is going to be running with Trump as vice president. So we've learned a lot about his anti-trans views and rhetoric. Well, we don't know if they're actually his views, but we know that that's in his rhetoric. So that's what we want to transition into, is really helping you understand how to make the case that if you are an LGBTQ ally or person, there's just no way to vote for Trump and be able to justify that in any way. So Jackie, tell us about this, please.
So speaking of Biden, I've very forcefully made the case for voting for President Biden on this podcast before. I stand by that case. Unfortunate debate performance notwithstanding. So speaking of Biden, there was a little bit of a weird situation recently that did annoy a lot of trans people, but thankfully the administration did overturn their initial statement. So what happened was the Biden administration put out a statement saying that they supported a ban on gender affirming surgeries for transgender minors. Now, part of the reason this is frustrating is because there's this Republican conservative narrative that there's a bunch of trans kids out there getting surgeries. And we've talked a lot about puberty blockers and hormone access for trans youth and trans minors, people who are under 18. That is a very important issue, but there are very, very few people under 18 getting any kind of gender affirming surgery. I actually found a study on gender affirming surgeries for people under 18 in the US that revealed that there were 150 people in the entire country who used insurance. This was a study of people who use insurance, so there might be more who didn't use insurance, but 150 people in the whole country who had any kind of gender affirming surgery before the age of 18. And out of those 150, 146 of them were for cisgender males getting breast reductions for excess tissue. So the idea that there's this epidemic of kids out there getting these gender affirming surgeries is really a myth. It's really not true. And so it was disappointing to see the Biden administration really even address this at all, let alone speaking out in favor of bans on these surgeries, which I don't know the details of those bans, but I would hope that those wouldn't affect these cisgender males who are getting breast reduction surgeries for excess tissue. That
Mhm.
seems like a legitimate medical thing as far as I'm aware. But the administration did go the other way with this and is now reaffirming its support for overturning those bans. So it's now saying that they don't support those bans after a lot of backlash. It was a significant policy change. It was kind of weird that they put out this statement in the first place, but thankfully they did undo that statement. It is a little weird. Don't understand why they did that.
Yeah, so just for us to confirm for everybody out there, in case there's any question, this was a mistake, and the Biden administration is in support of trans affirming care for even for minors, or at least they believe, from what I understand, they believe it's up to the family and the doctors involved and should not be something that the government interferes with.
Correct. Yes, they've always been supportive of trans rights, so it was nice to see them correct this weird thing. But it was a little disappointing and a little strange, and I hope they've figured out
Yeah.
whatever happened internally to cause them to do that.
Hmm.
Speaking of trans rights and trans policies, Trump did put out a video recently, or at least I saw a video on Twitter recently of Trump talking about how he will ask Congress to pass a bill establishing that the only genders recognized by the United States government are male and female, and they are assigned at birth. I found that very entertaining. I don't know what that would mean for me or other trans people, probably nothing good, but just the way he talks about it is very entertaining to me. He always seems like such an unserious person, but really, really scary stuff. I mean, I think he will definitely go out of his way, depending on whether he controls the House and or Senate, to get legislation passed that really severely negatively impacts the lives of trans people and just makes it a lot more difficult to transition to access healthcare to be trans in public. I think that he probably doesn't give a shit about trans people himself personally, frankly, which his vice presidential nominee, JD Vance, also probably doesn't, because JD Vance actually once gave an old friend who is no longer a friend, I think some kind of baked goods, cookies maybe, after they had top surgery. So he clearly doesn't really care about this culture war BS either. But it's really unfortunate because you have these people who are just doing this to rile up their base, to distract them on the economic issues while they cut taxes for billion-dollar corporations and millionaires and billionaires. And so they're going to toe the line and they're going to beat on trans people and use us as a wedge issue and a red herring for people who are really suffering, frankly, because of Trump and suffering from his economic policies, and will suffer a lot if he becomes president again, because if he does half of the things that he wants to do on trade, on immigration, it'll really hurt the economy in a big way. So it's unfortunate, but he's plowing ahead toward the presidency.
And this is an area where he's known for spewing lies, but this is an area where he just goes over the top. The quote that you just shared, Jackie. I'll just add to it. And this is, the video is out there. It's him saying it. We didn't make any of this up. What he said after what Jackie just shared, and this is a direct quote of him that I saw in a video of him. He said, no serious country should be telling its children that they were born the wrong gender, a concept that was never heard of in all of human history. Nobody's ever heard of this, what's happening today. It was all when the radical left invented it just a few years ago. What? This clip was on the show last week tonight with John Oliver. I would catch that whole segment if you can, because John Oliver responds to it, even though he responds in a humorous way. I know he's a comedian. There's a lot of truth to the way he responds. It is filled with falsehoods that are easy to prove untrue. There have always been trans people. We have documentation of many trans people throughout all of history, much of which has been suppressed, and we're trying to unearth and get back, but there's a long, rich history there. The radical left invented it a few years ago, and we're telling our children that they're born the wrong gender? My head is just exploding as I'm listening to this. Listen to all our podcast episodes. Jackie told me she's transgender. I'm the one, and all the parents I know and have talked to, hundreds, probably thousands, no one ever told their kid they were the wrong gender. In fact, many of us are completely in shock and cannot believe or grasp the idea when our child tells us, not that they're the wrong gender, but tells us what their gender actually is, because we were mistaken. I was mistaken thinking Jackie was male, and she informed me that she's female. And that's the way it happens, people. So what Trump is saying is just filled with so many lies and misrepresentations of what's really happening for the many of us who have transgender people in our family and love and support them. So it's just mind-boggling.
I didn't tell you about the deep state radical left agents that showed up at my door and turned me trans.
Oh
No, Joe
no,
Biden sent them.
no,
Didn't
you
tell you
left out
about
that
them.
part. That's what Trump thinks happened.
Okay, okay. Well, I think that, again, I don't know that Trump really believes this or cares. I think that it's interesting. The people who really do believe this stuff and really do care, they're often motivated by some kind of personal grievance against some trans person. I've noticed, like Elon Musk, for example, recently announced that he's gonna move Twitter, or X, which he calls it now, over to, I think, Texas, Austin, Texas, out of San Francisco, still keeping some portion of their office space here in San Francisco, so not completely moving out, but supposedly moving the company's headquarters, all because California passed a law and our governor signed into law a bill that prevents schools from forcibly outing kids to their parents. So that a kid, if they want to come out at school to a teacher, to a friend, and a teacher overhears it, if they want to come out to a guidance counselor, whoever it is at school, they can do that, and they will not be forcibly outed to their parents, who in many cases kick trans kids out of the house, leaving them homeless, leaving them to resort to sex work, leaving them to often end up getting into drugs and dealing with really severe mental health issues. That happens because kids are forcibly outed to their parents when they're not ready to be out, or because kids sometimes come out to their parents and trust their parents. But it's really, really important for schools to be a safe place for kids. And because California did that, Elon Musk said, I'm going to move my company out of California. Now, that's really because he has a trans kid and he's upset that his kid is trans. And I think that's a real shame, and it's really disappointing.
Really sad. I want to elaborate just a bit on what Jackie said about how many of the Republicans don't actually care at all about trans rights one way or the other. And they're totally hypocritical. And a lot of information has been coming out about J.D. Vance prior to joining the MAGA movement. And one person who I'm thankful to for speaking out is Sophia Nelson, who was a former classmate of Vance and his wife. When Nelson had top surgery, J.D. Vance and his wife delivered home-baked treats to their home while they were recovering from the surgery. And Sophia Nelson is coming out with this because it's obvious that J.D. Vance and his wife were supportive, or at least wanted to show their support for transgender folks and gender affirming surgeries prior to joining on to Trump's campaign. And on another note, I've heard that JD Vance was incredibly critical of Trump prior to this. So he can't be trusted at all.
So another issue that we want to talk about this month was really disappointing op-ed. There's been a number of these disappointing op-eds in the New York Times about trans people. This one was titled, "Why is the US Still Pretending We Know Gender Affirming Care Works?" It's by this woman, Pamela Paul, who has published articles like this before. 4 months ago, Paul published a 4,500 word error-filled article, so severely flawed that she later released a follow-up piece in response to criticism, backpedaling and admitting a lack of knowledge. Thankfully, journalist Erin Reed has posted a really good, really thorough debunking of her most recent article. So I'm going to read just a few little excerpts of that debunking. I encourage you to read the full thing at erininthemorning.com. That's Erin, ERIN, inthemorning.com. She is a really great journalist, and I encourage you to support her work. So one of the main claims in this Pamela Paul New York Times op-ed is that gender dysphoria is temporary, and that trans youth will grow out of being trans, and we should treat trans youth with therapy alone. Therapy meaning basically conversion therapy, trying to convince them that they don't need to transition and therefore that they're not really trans. So the fact is that transgender identification is rarely temporary. The vast majority of transgender youth continue to identify as trans many years later. Even the infamous British Cass review only found fewer than 10 detransitioners out of 3,000 patients. Another claim that this New York Times op-ed makes is that Dr. Cass showed that there is no evidence that transgender youth will turn to suicide if they're denied care. The fact is that transgender youth who transition are at a much lower risk of suicide. A Cornell review of more than 51 studies determined that trans care significantly improves the mental health of transgender people. One major study even found a 73% lower suicidality among trans youth who had gender affirming care. A similar study found a 40% reduction in actual suicide attempts over the previous year. And in a recent article published in the Journal of Adolescent Health in April 2024, puberty blockers were found to have significantly reduced depression and anxiety. So these claims are really misleading, and it's really unfortunate that the New York Times continues to publish op-eds by people who have been so thoroughly discredited as Pamela Paul, but we'll continue to talk about them and explain why those claims are not true, because unfortunately there is a really large audience for these op-eds, and it's important to refute those claims and to amplify good journalism and good counter op-eds that refute those, like Erin's.
Yeah, I'm so thankful to Erin in the Morning. Everybody, if you are not following her, you must follow her. When these articles come out with all of these false claims, these anti-trans false claims, she immediately responds and debunks all of the information and gives the correct information. So we want to really make sure that you're following her. She is also engaged to Zoe Zephyr, who we want to make sure you're following in the political world.
Yeah, Zoe Zephyr's a state representative in Montana fighting for housing, healthcare, and human rights. She's really impressive, so definitely check her out. Donate if you can. And next, we wanted to close out the news roundup on a happy note by talking about Nikki Hiltz, a non-binary Olympic runner. This is from an article in the San Francisco Chronicle. Nikki Hiltz surged past their competitors down the final stretch of the 1,500-meter race at the 2024 U.S. Track and Field Olympic Trials, turning a competitive race into a dominant win and making American track and field history in the process. Their time of 3 minutes, 55.33 seconds was the second fastest ever recorded by an American in the women's event and set a trial record, securing Hiltz their first Olympic berth. Hiltz is transgender and non-binary and joined a handful of openly transgender American Olympians. Openly transgender and intersex athletes have been part of the global sports scene since at least the 1930s, and the international sports world has varied in its approach toward transgender and intersex inclusion since then. Thankfully, the Olympics do have a pretty clear policy allowing trans people to participate, or at least guidelines. I don't think it's necessarily enforced, but it's recommended.
Yeah, and I just want to say we may talk about this more later, but I highly recommend the book The Race to Be Myself by Castor Semenya. And she taught me in that book a ton about this issue of gender diversity in sports. And there's so much of it that I never understood that's been happening all along. And there are all kinds of regulations and controls and ways that that's managed that work and that have worked. So this rhetoric around, again, from the Republican Party, boys competing against girls and having an unfair advantage, it's nonsense. It's not happening. And it's just part of their talking points to scare people and make people think that transgender people are trying to do things that they're not actually trying to do. So it's really important to be informed on the sports issue, and lots of good work coming out to help us understand that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And then I know we want to close it out today by giving an update on some of the work we're doing, right?
Yeah, just really brief because I want to make sure that everybody knows that we are going to be offering a live course, a 1-hour course. We really want you to join us live on Zoom, September 28th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., just 1 hour. That's Pacific Standard Time. So translate it into your time. Come join us on Zoom. You don't have to turn your camera on. You can just listen in, or you can if you want to. We have been doing this for about 3.5 years. We've learned a lot. We've done live courses in the past, but we haven't done one for a while. So we said, I think it's time to come back and bring some new content and refresh what we've talked about in the past. Really, in the last 3.5 years, things have gotten crazier and crazier and worse and more challenging than they used to be, especially what we're seeing on the political front. So there's so much more to talk about now. And we are charging $25. We hope that's affordable for you, but we need to cover our costs for transgender school. And so this is going to be an opportunity for everybody to join us live. And if you would like to join us, please sign up. Just go to our website. It's transgenderschool.org. The invitation is on Eventbrite, and the link to that is on our website. It's very, very easy to sign up. Just click the link and you can sign up there. If you have any problems, let us know. But we really are hoping to fill up that class. And the topics are going to be current events and a little bit, again, about our experience with Jackie's coming out and where we are now with it and the things we've learned and some of our top recommendations for how to be an even better ally. That's how I'm positioning this, is how to be an even better ally, because we know you're all allies and that's why you're here. But we don't know if everybody knows those really nuanced kind of recommendations that we have that can help you to be an even better ally in these really difficult, divisive times when so many people are talking about this issue more than they ever have been before because of the terrible things that the Republican Party is saying. So please join us. Jackie, anything you want to add to that?
Hope to see you there. Transgenderschool.org for more details. Sign up on Eventbrite. And if you really want to attend, but you can't afford it, reach out to us at info@transgenderschool.org. No one will be turned away for lack of funds. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening.
Absolutely. We hope to see you in that live course. We'd love to connect with you in real time. And we thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thanks, everybody. Please vote for Biden or whoever is on the Democratic ticket. And I'm sure by the time you're hearing this or seeing this, things will have changed even more. So we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks, everybody.